Subject this morning, marriage that cannot fail. Isn't that some subject? I approach it with fear and trembling. But what I will not perhaps be able to guarantee that what that subject implies, but I will guarantee to tell you some of the reasons why they fail. And then surely you can correct it if any of you are having trouble. Of course, I realize that there's something wrong with marriage. Why do so many marriages fail? Divorces are increasing. There must be, and there is, a reason. People do not realize the purpose of marriage. That is, they do not realize the full purpose of marriage. Marriage is necessary to keep this show going, so to speak, but that's not the real purpose of marriage. The real purpose of marriage is quite different. The real purpose of marriage is to enable those who need to go this particular way to see in one another the presence of God, and as such to work towards the end of union in Him. And the most wonderful part is that if they will treat marriage that way, instead of being left without anything in the end, as are those who follow marriage only on the physical plane, both are saved. Both return home to God. Now, we're supposed to be sensible people. We must realize that marriage can be successful, and the reward is that neither one is lost. Both are safe in the conscious presence of God. That's what we should understand about marriage, and that's what we should do with our marriage if we are not doing it now. If we follow the rules which our Master has laid down in the saints of ages, marriage will be successful. It cannot fail. And so what is wrong with a marriage nowadays? It is this, that the youth is trained too much on the physical and mental plane. And the spiritual side or plane and the disciplinary side of marriage is neglected. Self-discipline is neglected. The physical side is emphasized plenty, and the mental side. But the spiritual side, and that side which requires that we discipline ourselves, is wholly neglected, especially nowadays. And God is forgotten almost completely. That's why marriage does not succeed. There is no control over the senses and the moods and the desires and impulses. Isn't that true with the young people nowadays? As Master used to say, first find God. Then your reason will be balanced. Your impulses will be balanced. Your senses will be balanced. Then get married and it'll be successful. That's what does not happen now. These other things are allowed to run wild. And you see the result of it if your eyes are open at all. That's the reason why marriage fails. If we correct those things and emphasize more the spiritual aspect and the discipline which is so necessary to curtail these senses, to curtail these desires and these moods which lead to all the trouble, then reason will come forth and the marriage will be successful. It's very simple when you see it, but it's hard and difficult when the majority of people go the other way, and they sure do in these times. And so self-discipline in a hermitage is very good in the beginning, in the younger age. And then when the reason is balanced, then get married. But if you do not do that, well, we know what's going on all around us, because too much emphasis is on the physical and mental side. That's all. And poor God is neglected. He's not thought of at all. Until trouble comes, and people find the world are not ready to help them get out of their difficulties, then belatedly they turn to God. Why not turn to Him first, as the sages pointed out? And so, first establish yourself on the spiritual path, the Master said. First establish yourself on the spiritual path, then, if it is your path, then be married, and it will be successful. If you once establish yourself and know the presence of God, marriage is wonderful. It will be consummated as it should be, not a one-sided, lopsided affair, all on the material side, but it will be a balanced affair, and the goal of life will be accomplished, as I will point out a little later in a scriptural reference. Marriage is an honorable institution, and those who have considered it and treated it as that and taken God with them will testify that they see God in their mate, not something else. That's the way the Lord wanted us to do it. What of it if you have a little difficulty in the beginning of marriage? What of it? Doesn't it take time to get adjusted to any condition? But there is one key point that we must not forget. There must be in every successful marriage, and that is this. No matter what comes, no matter what the difficulties, no matter what the objections that come up to one another, there is an indissoluble bond between those who are married correctly. And what is that indissoluble bond? God's love, God Himself. What of it if they have fights, which they all do in the beginning? Some of them have some good ones. But I know those who are truly married, they never forget that thing, and you can't eradicate it. That indissoluble bond that God is in the other one. They may do a good job on one another, as they have their squabbles. But when it comes to the showdown, no, that indissoluble bond of God's presence is there. That makes true marriage, and marriage cannot fail if they will find God first. Be secure on the spiritual path first, and let come what may, it makes no difference. If it's a happy, smooth marriage, fine. If it's a rough one, the end is the same, isn't it? And that is, they both go to God. If they keep it on the physical plane, holy, what happens? In the end, nothing. Nothing. Because material things pass away. And that marriage will pass away, and the two of them will be lost. But if it is kept on a spiritual plane, things of spirit last. Both are safe and conscious in the presence of God at the end of the marriage. That's what we must understand. If it's kept too much on the material plane, it can only end as all things of matter end. And especially we must remember this, that it usually ends in sickness and ill health and disrespect for one another completely and fully. Is that the way marriage should be? No, it should be the other way. They should feel when they get married that indissoluble bond of God's love. And though on this earth there'll always be trouble, in this world in which we live, there'll always be trouble, there'll always be duality and sorrow, because that's the nature of it. But isn't the presence of God, that indissoluble bond of God's love, isn't that permanent? Isn't that the unity of God's presence? That is not diversity at all. That is what lasts. So those who are about to be married, if there are any here, remember these things. Get God first. Seek Him out first. And then, if you are to be married, it can only come out the right way, because the indissoluble bond of God's presence will be the matrix of that marriage. So the purpose of marriage, as I have pointed out, I think somewhat so far is that instead of creating only on the physical plane and mental plane, there should be a fusion of souls with their spiritual qualities. These mind and soul fusions should produce spiritual children who manifest love and understanding, character, purity, noble ambitions, and creative inventions. These are our Master's words. Now that will not come if we keep the marriage wholly on the physical plane. There must be a fusion of the soul qualities of the two. And with that will come these things which I have enumerated. Once I said to the Master, I hope I'm not saying things too personal, but I had a couple children and they were, as I say, wild Indians. I said, Sir, what am I going to do with these kids? He says, don't worry. I don't know as I hate to say this, but he says, with two such parents, they'll be all right. But listen, I give all the credit to him. But that's what he said. So I tell you who are married or going to be married, be that which the Lord wants you to be and the Master wants you to be. And you have a much greater chance of the children coming out as you'd like to have them come out. Spiritual examples of the presence of God in them. Now, another purpose of marriage is that both return to God. That to me is the greatest thing, because you who are married know what you really think of your wife or husband underneath, and you know that the thing you fear is that you'll have to leave one another. But you will not have to leave them if you have that indissoluble bond of God's love between you. You will not have to leave them. So that's the second reason that we should understand the purposes of marriage. And the third is that the ideal husband and wife who live more on the spiritual plane, more on the love, in the mental and spiritual planes, will automatically move toward emancipation in God. Isn't that wonderful? Automatically it'll be taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. That's the law. That's why the first commandment is what? Love God with all thy strength and thy heart and thy might, married or not married. And the second is, feel me and see me in the hearts of others. That's the purpose of marriage. The purpose of life is to return home to God, to unite your consciousness with His presence, single or married. The single people who do not have to be married, according to the law of attraction and karma, they still have the same goal of life, and that is to unite their consciousness with God's consciousness. Those who are married, they have the same goal of life, to see God in one another and thereby help each other to return home to God. So what does it make any difference whether you're single or married? Except, as I understand it, it's easier if you're single, in some cases. But I haven't found it too difficult, except in the beginning it was a little rough. But by the grace of God, that bond is there. And I know it's there. I was going to say in everybody here, but some of you are not married. But still, the bond must be there. The bond must be there. I have a reference which the Master has given us at this time. As I told you, I approach this subject with fear and trembling. I hope I don't get into difficulties too much. But these are truths. Coming events cast their shadows. Let me give you Master's words from one of his little books. Today, there aren't many real soul unions. I say, taking the overall picture, that is so, but I know it is not so in those who are following self-realization, its meditations and its techniques. I know it cannot be so. But it is, on the outside, there's no question of his words, that his words are true. Emotionally immature and unstable, they are usually influenced by the fleeting sex attraction or worldly considerations that ignore the noble purpose of marriage. He added, I often say, now these are Master's words, first, establish yourself irrevocably on the divine path. Then, if you marry, You won't make a mistake. So any of you who are here contemplating marriage, remember the Master's words. They're invaluable. He's the voice of God to those who follow him. I was going to read you the marriage vows of Self-Realization Fellowship Church, or some of them, but time is fleeting. But I know you'll get the gist of them as you listen to the explanation this morning. Now, the first rule for marriage that cannot fail is this. There are three main rules. The first is that do not keep your marriage too much on the physical plane. If kept too much on the physical plane, I have pointed out, the end result is zero, because material things, marriages of a material nature, will surely pass away. You cannot escape it. So that's the first rule. We must realize that. Now, the seriousness of this problem of lifting the marriage from the physical plane depends upon the latent tendencies of the participants. Now, never mind the latent tendencies if they're not desirable. They can all be changed by following a meditative life, and especially by the practices of Kriya Yoga. Those who lead a marriage which is too much on the physical plane have their consciousness in the three lower centers of the spine. That's where their consciousness dwells. Now, by serving others and by practicing the meditations of Self-Realization Fellowship or Truth of Yoga, either one you want to call it, your consciousness will automatically lift it to the higher centers of the spine, and then it will be much easier to keep your marriage on the spiritual plane. It's absolutely scientific. If those who are having trouble with marriages will follow these meditations of self-realization, and especially Kriya Yoga, and keep at it, and do not fall by the wayside, they will win in the end, because it's impossible for the life force to stay down in the lower part of the spine. It will elevate itself to the presence of God here. Automatically. That's what Master meant when I read. They will automatically be led to emancipation in God's love. These are absolute facts. That's the first rule, therefore, is not to keep the marriage too much on the physical plane. Second rule is this. And this is a real rule. Learn to behave with one another. Some marriages are good ones. They do not behave with one another. I don't have to tell you what goes on. Well, what's the trouble? The trouble is this. Living in so close contact, it's apt to breed familiarity, and you know familiarity may breed contempt. Why? Because there's not that mutual respect for one another which there should be. And so the second rule is to learn to behave with one another. Have that divine carriage. Have that divine carriage of two souls mixing together. Two souls mixing together. And you cannot have that divine carriage unless you see God in your mate. It's impossible. But if you see him in your mate, then that divine carriage will come out, because you are all made in the image of God. We're all made in his image, and what is he? He is love. God is love. And so, the second rule is very important. Learn to behave with one another. Learn self-control. How? By following one who had that self-control, as our Master, who has given us these teachings of Self-Realization Fellowship, whereby you control the life force in the body. And instead of flying off the handle when you shouldn't, the life force is under control. It cannot operate. You cannot get mad, so to speak, if the life force doesn't flow that way. It's absolutely scientific. And if you learn the right methods of meditation and the different techniques of self-realization teachings, especially Kriya Yoga, self-control is bound to come. That's why it's so important to meditate every day, and meditate in the right way, not just contemplation, but by putting your attention on the presence of God within. Don't you think if you mix with God, you'll attain self-control? If you mix with those who do not have self-control, you'll be just like them. If you mix with God, who is peace and calm and bliss, you're bound to develop self-control. Therefore, those who are married, if they follow the spiritual path and meditate regularly and do their Kriya Yoga especially, they are bound to improve. They cannot do otherwise. Such is the law of God's presence in each and every one of us. So that's the second rule. Both act to please God. Both act to please God. That's the easiest way. If it has reached a point where you cannot please one another, forget it. Get somebody else to please. Both act to please God, and He will bring you two together like that. That's His power. There's no greater power on the earth than God's love. God's love is supreme. So if you cannot, at this stage, love one another, love the other one, or try to do it to please God is the answer. And see what He does with you. But if you try to do it with your ego consciousness, the battle will increase. But if you do it to please God, it will not increase. It will level off, and things will be better. I had a little story that came to me, because I believe we need just a little rest for a moment here. And this husband was lugged into court, and I think the charge was intense mental cruelty. Isn't that what they use sometimes? Intense mental cruelty. So the judge said to this husband, he said, "Your wife says that you haven't spoken to her for 10 years. What have you got to say for yourself?" Well, the poor fellow answered, "Well," he says, "I didn't want to interrupt her." Extreme mental cruelty. Now, I'm afraid I may get into difficulty telling that telling that story, which seems to be against one half of the marriage. So I'll tell another one I have told here before, and I hope you'll enjoy it as I enjoyed it the first time I heard it. You know, the husbands have a particular trait of saying, "Come up and ride in my car. Come up and see my television. Come to my house, see?" So this particular husband came home this day, and he came up the stairs, and he came bustling in the front door, and he says, "Hi, honey, is my dinner ready?" She says, "I've had enough," to herself, and she gave it to him, beat him up, knocked him down under the table. But he didn't come out, and then she began to wonder if she'd killed him or what. And she says, come up out of there, you're good for nothing." He says, "Just a minute, dear. I'm looking for our hat." So now I think I'm even with both sides. So we will go on. So if any of you have any trouble, remember that story. I have a reference here at this time to take us back to the ideal marriage, which Master used to speak about, and that was his mother and father. We've heard a little bit about them from Mr. Probation, but this is from Master's own words, his writings. Father and mother were Bengalis of the Shastriya caste. Both were blessed with saintly nature. Their mutual love, tranquil and dignified, never expressed itself frivolously. A perfect parental harmony was the calm center, that indissoluble bond. A perfect parental harmony was the calm center for the revolting tumult of 8 young lions. As a daily gesture of respect for father, in the afternoons, mother would dress children carefully to welcome him home from the office. Isn't that nice? Although perhaps we cannot take the time in this rush and bustle of this life Still we can do little things, but the greatest thing is to feel the indissoluble bond in the heart of the mate. That's the most wonderful thing. Now, the third rule is keep the marriage on the spiritual plane. I think I have pointed out enough about that. But if this is done, then one sees God in the other. That's the key point. If this is done, one sees God in the other. If that happens, the marriage is secure. The marriage will not fail. If we see the presence of God in the other. And the second reason is, as I have pointed out, it should be kept on the spiritual plane because love will be perfected in the other. There is no question, but the woman has qualities different than the men. They have a different makeup. They're an aspect of God. That's why marriage, when it's right, is the highest path to reach God. Because there's give and take in it, and plenty of it. But one has the feeling aspect developed, and the other has the intellect developed or the reasoning aspect. And when both go together, both are elevated into the presence of God. And so, remember that the true purpose of marriage is that both return to God. And one thing I have been thinking about when age comes in marriage, I've talked to many people. Some there's nothing there to look forward to. But if they both will follow God, create that indivisible bond, indissoluble bond. If it is not there, create it. And then, instead of having emptiness to look forward, they will have the joy of God's presence. That's why the third and perhaps the greatest rule is that the marriage should be kept on a spiritual plane. Now, this is attested to in the Bible, showing that the greatest respect should be there for the mate. For in Corinthians, we read the duty of both, the duty of the wife and the duty of the husband. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? You are a child of God, every one of you. Wives, here. You may think you amount to nothing, but that is not true. How do you know? But God is coming through you to save your husband and to give him emancipation. These are the words from our Bible. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Doesn't that put a different aspect in marriage? How do you know? How do I know how God is going to work? People come to me and they say, oh, I don't want to go to physicians. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. How do they know how God is going to heal them? God heals through many ways. You cannot follow him. He is so secretive and so subtle. But if you have pure faith in God, what do you care the way he comes? Whether it's through medicine or through other means to be healed, I don't care long as God comes. And I'm sure we should take that wonderful thing with us in marriage. And instead of feeling we can do nothing because the husband perhaps is giving us some trouble or vice versa, why not take it to God? Why not take it to him? He can use you to heal the other one, and he will if you have that extreme faith in him. Such is the power of God. But what do? We do not approach him. We try to do it ourselves and forget that he is the sole doer. And he is in the husband, he is in the wife, and it is he who is in both. That is what we have to learn. Then marriage will take an entirely different aspect, and both will return home to God. I have two illustrations of perfect marriages. That is, first is Gandhi's marriage. Mahatma Gandhi. Do you know what he was? A great Mahatma, a great example, a great saint. And he has this to say about his marriage, which I hope you will not forget. And he says this about his wife. He's very truthful and very exact. For he says, "My wife moves me as no other woman in the world can. Not that she has no faults." See, he was a pretty wise man. "Not that she has no faults. I dare say she has many more than I see myself. But the feeling of an indissoluble bond is there." Now, those are Gandhi's own words. Get that indissoluble bond. If it isn't there, make it. Just know it. It's there, of course. Understand it and realize it. And the other illustration is of Lahiri Mahasaya, one of our great saints. Lahiri Mahasaya was in the world, but not of it. Lahiri Mahasaya was a perfect example for householders. Showed that by his example, how worldly people engaged in normal living, family life, with husband and wife and children and all that goes on, could remain unattached to the trouble, unattached like the lotus in the pond. You know, the lotus grows in a muddy pond, dark, murky waters, but there's the beautiful lotus coming up, clear and pure and beautiful, as you know the lotus is. So Lahiri Mahasaya, that's why he is one of our saints, to give the example of finding God in spite of the distractions of family life and children, and he has got in there, and wife. But his is a great example. Lahiri Mahasaya, he believed, and he practiced self-realization techniques and Kriya Yoga, and nobody knew what he was doing. And his wife complained that he was spending too much time with the devotees and that, and he began to remonstrate with her, and suddenly the whole room was filled with the vibration of the Holy Ghost, and she really turned the other way and didn't know what was happening. And he touched her here, and the mass of light came. What happened? She followed him, turned and followed him, and he was her guru. That's the highest example. And as I understand from Master in India, that the wives look to the husbands as the guru. Why not? God is in them. If they measure up to it, they certainly can be that. And so we have pros and cons for successful marriage, and let us realize, wives, that make your life so that you have the respect of the husband. And husbands, so act with your wives, so feel God in them, that they will have that reverence which is due you, just as your reverence is due them. And there's no greater joy than going back to God together with your mate into his great love and calmness and peace and bliss and full security. There's no security in this worldly living in marriage unless you have that indissoluble bond and both return home to God. And I'll close with a word from the Master. As he says, by placing us in families, which seem so difficult at first, God does the greatest thing for us. He gives us the greatest opportunity to show him that we can stand anything. And when persecutions come to you, and problems come, and sorrows come, thank God for it. Because if you can stand those and show him that no matter what the trial is, you'll never leave his side, you have won. We cannot resist that. We will not resist it. And so God affords us an opportunity to overcome selfishness and find it easier to think of others by being in a family. In friendships, he offers us a way to broaden our sympathies, further broaden them. Even that is not the end. We should continue to expand our love until it becomes divine. That's the key. Encompassing all beings everywhere. Otherwise, how may we achieve oneness with God, the Father of all? God is. He's the only one. There's no other consciousness. Take that with you in your marriage. And no matter what comes, with that indissoluble bond, the marriage will be successful. It cannot fail.